Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that you're really going to enjoy. So Columbia University is under siege. It feels like every couple years we have to have a university campus that erupts into some kind of sit-in, massive protest, lockdown, woke eruption. And we're going to touch on that. We're going to look at all the dynamics at play. I also want to talk about postmodernism. It is the greatest boogeyman of our time, but I think it's also something that deserves to be properly understood, properly addressed as we look for hopefully alternatives to many of the theories that progressives have put forward for our current situation. And joining me to do that is one of the foremost online experts on postmodernism. He's an artist, he is a prolific podcaster. Gio, thanks for joining me, man.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Auron. It's always great when we get together. I think it's a lot of fun. You let me ramble on. Who is in the chat? Ruffian. Can Gio finish 2 sentences without derailing himself? No, I cannot. No, I cannot. Oh, well, I'll try. I'll try. I'll try. But yeah,
Well,
it's great. Great to be here.
you're a powerful speaker, you're powerful, a presence on any live stream. You're wearing your court mandated fez, and so I think people are
There's a
prepared.
tracker in here. I'm going to be under house arrest soon, according
Right, yeah.
to this.
The Canadian government is, they're awarding fezes to all of the people they want to make sure to prepare to move,
Oh
and
man.
concentrate in any specific locations they might need to. All right, guys. So like I said, we're gonna get into the siege of Columbia University and postmodernism. But before we do that, let me tell you about your absolute moral duty to hire based people through new founding. Hey guys, I need to talk to you about new founding. Look, we all know that the job market is a disaster right now. Based people can't find good companies to work for, and good companies can't find employees to get the work done. And that's why you need access to the New Founding Network. New Founding has created a network of high excellence professionals who are seeking to join grounded American businesses. They're individuals, often in elite organizations, who are ready for a team and mission that supports their values instead of working against them. Aligned companies are already using the network to hire high trust, exceptional individuals who match the culture and mission of their team. You can apply for access to the New Founding Talent Network at newfounding.com/talent. You'll be connected with candidates who will build your business. That's newfounding.com/talent. Go there now to find your next hire. All right. So, like I said, this stream was originally going to be about postmodernism. We're definitely going to get to that, but we have to talk about the news of the day, especially when it's this ridiculous. And the hot story right now is the protest. It's been going on, I think, for 5 or 6 days at Columbia University. It's a pro-Palestinian protest, and a lot of people are up in arms about many of the things that are happening there. You've got a giant tent city. It's been declared an autonomous zone. The students are taking over.
Oh, they're doing the Chaz thing again?
Yeah. It's all the
Oh boy.
terrible, quasi-Marxist lockdown stuff. Like, oh, no one can walk through without their reparations pass or whatever.
Hmm.
People screaming all kinds of stuff at possibly Jewish students. We got a guy who, of course, looks exactly like this. Trying to stop a professor for coming on to the campus because he's Jewish. A lot of people very angry. Large protest going on here, and it's interesting because the response to this has been, oh, got rid of Geo instead of getting rid of
What?
this. All right, there we go.
There
So
you
the response to this has been very interesting. We've had a lot of people screaming about actions that need to be taken. We've had a lot of people saying, this is the next Charlottesville, which is a very interesting framing for many people on the right to take,
go.
or from the mainstream conservative view to take. But I feel like this was inevitable, right? This has been building for a long time. There's been this back and forth of kind of inter left wing political discourse, or
Mhm.
infighting. Are the woke going to be in charge, or kind of more of the establishment left that tend to be more pro-Israel in charge? What's going to be the dominant faction inside the left on universities? Uh,
Yeah.
and we've had the first, you had the pro-Palestinian side strike with all of these protests, and then you kind of had the pro-Israeli side, kind of strike with the firing of a number of administrators or other people put under pressure to make sure that they're kind of pushing back. And now we see kind of the reemergence of the woke vanguard. What do you make of this, Gio?
Well, it's hard to say because, again, on the one hand, it is sort of like the importing of ethnic rivalries into the domestic politics. Although I will say that this is different because of the relationship between the American government and the Israeli state. Now, unlike a lot of people in political right, I tend to be more sympathetic with the Palestinians. I think the actual things that are going on are quite terrible. And I pray for the end of the destruction of human life as quickly as possible. And I mean, whether you want to talk about proportionate responses to what happened on October 7th is a different issue, but it's certainly the actions that have been taken or have been incredible and have been devastating. But that being said, when it comes to these protests, it's one of those things, and again, to relate to the main topic about postmodernism, it's one of those issues where political categories tend to be shaken up and tend to be mixed. Because on the one hand, the political discourse in America, particularly among normative conservatives and normative liberals, or what constitute the mainstream, is that yes, of course, the right wing, or rather conservatives, are pro-Israel, and the left have been sort of on the pro-Palestinian side for so long, and a criticism of that is inconceivable from the right wing because, of course, criticism of that state in the Middle East from the right is, of course, verboten and illegal and so forth. But that being said, I think that there is a weird mix-up of political categories because there are numerous critics who are either the political right or even conservatives that are looking at the actions in Palestine. But I think what's really key is to divorce the greater leftist sort of activism you see in university with the concrete issues of what's going on in the ground in Gaza. And that's very difficult because, of course, the political left has monopolized this issue for so long. But when it comes to university campuses, it's interesting because out of all the issues, this is the one that gets the ire of the state, where they arrested Ilhan Omar's daughter, I believe, got arrested, or she was escorted out of university. Because, of course, all the elite kids, they all go to like Columbia or Harvard or whatever, right? And whether, I mean, personally, I mean, oh man, I sound so, I know what I'm going to sound like, but as much as I do not like someone like Ilhan Omar, I do think that escorting and, suspending her daughter, if she hasn't done anything wrong, that's kind of like, wow, that's pretty severe. But I will say that the intimidation and towards professors who are Jewish or students who are Jewish, of course, that's that shouldn't be allowed. But see, this is the problem with this intra-leftist conflict, is because where do you side on the progressive stack? Do you side with Israelis or Jewish academics, or do you side with the largely student body who do side with Palestine? Because this is one of the few times in which the elite opinion of the left do not line up with the pedestrian or the ground level grassroots opinion of most people. Most people on the ground who are of the political left are very pro-Palestine. But when it comes to the actual institutions, the actual fortitude and testing of it, that's what the problem is. Now, my prediction will be that I think the political left can find a synthesis or a solution in terms of American domestic culture war politics. What they will do is they will sort of, and evoking Charlottesville is very interesting in this regard. I think what they'll do is they'll focus and they'll hammer down on trying to rein in the quote unquote anti-Semitism on a cultural level, right? But they'll say that criticizing Israel is not in itself a criticism of Jewish people proper, and they'll sort of try to square that circle. Now, whether they can square that circle is difficult, because of course nowadays, especially in university campuses, you have a lot of different people of different backgrounds that do not share the same cultural understandings or the same historical understandings of people, for example, who have come from a Western European or even Eastern European or North American uh, ancestry, who have grown up with the sort of the awareness and the consciousness of the last century, right? When you have people of vastly different cultural understandings, then this is a very big problem when it comes to this issue in particular. And like I say, I'm very sympathetic to people of the Palestinians themselves. I think what's happening is very it's an atrocity. But that being said, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is from a right wing angle. This is a very sticky issue, though, and I don't know if we should say any more. But I think that the political left will try to sort of wrap it up, Oren. The political left will try to sort of mediate an understanding between accommodating people of one ethnicity and accommodating the vast majority of people who are pro-Palestinian. Will it happen all of a sudden? No. And I think these university protests are a growing pain. And one last very point, I'm very sorry I'm rambling, but one last point is that you do see this sort of cultural model of university protest, the way that it was structured is coming from the boomers, coming from the 60s. This is, the 68 Democratic National Convention, or this is Kent State all over again. And of course, I mean, I hope the police don't go out of their way to hurt protesters. Obviously, it's their right to protest. I don't think that intimidating certain students should be, allowed, of course. That's crossing the line. But I mean, yeah, I mean, the reality is that it's their right to protest, of course. And I think that there will be a number of growing pains when it comes to intra-leftist discourse. That's pretty obvious. Yeah, sorry, I rambled. Yeah, there you go.
No, it's fine. It's all good insights. Yeah, I agree with you that this is just a mess all over the place because first, personally, I think this is just at this point, a unresolvable ethnic blood feud between two peoples who have just been brutal to each other for a very long time. I think there's zero hope of the United States or anyone else, negotiating them out of this scenario.
Right.
And so I would just like it to not be on my shores. I when I say I don't want us involved, I mean I really don't want us involved one way or the other. I think there is a mistake. There's a lot of people who perhaps don't like the perceived influence of Israel on United States foreign policy, and so they automatically side with Palestinians, even though many of these Palestinians would hate them, and vice versa. A lot of people who are not paying attention to perhaps the way that the United States has involved itself unnecessarily in this situation, feel some knee-jerk reaction to involve itself in kind of a neocon foreign policy aspect and immediately side with Israel. It's like, guys, this is just not productive. Like this does not help the United States at all. We should not, this is where Curtis Yarvin is right in this. And I know some people that'll make people very angry, but you should
make me angry, Oren. It'll make me to say he's right.
But you should not. We need to divest ourselves from this impulse to have moral outrage at every event that happens across the world. Of course, we don't have that option because we specifically imported it here. So that should be the ideal. That should be the way a normal, healthy nation would not be like, oh wow, a random blood feud has flared up again in some country halfway across the world. It immediately needs to result in violence and protests across my nation. But that's where we are now. And so it creates this scenario where, like you said, there's the standard operating procedure, it feels like now for the leftist protests. Okay, establish your autonomous zone. Start doing these, these struggle sessions, capture people.
The sit-ins and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah. There's this and in a way that's kind of the revolutionary reenactment, right? Like this is my my moment of the campus protest. Like, even if there wasn't an issue to protest, I would need there to be an issue to protest just so I can go through the formative ritual of engaging in a protest as a leftist on a campus. There's a lot of that happening too. And so I think the main thing is just the frustration from watching this result. Let me bring this up really quick because there have been a number of people who, like I said, it's the government needs to get involved. They need to come in and take action. We've got Josh Hawley saying Eisenhower sent the 101st to Little Rock. It's time for Biden to call out the National Guard.
God.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting reference.
It
To be
would
sure.
sink the Democrats. I would say it will. It would. You know what I mean? Like they're in an interesting position, Orem, because I think that the one good thing though is there are certain elites in the American government who realize that from a Democrat perspective, it's bad optics. And so they want the Israelis to cool it down or settle for a negotiated peace. And of course, Trump has said that he wants the conflict gone. He thinks that Netanyahu went way too far. And there's been a lot of, there has been a lot of, people used to think that Netanyahu and Trump, they were like best friends, but unfortunately, like I believe their relationship has strained. So at least there is solid agreement that this is a pretty negative thing on the world stage. I mean, I will push back a little bit on you, Oren. I would say that because of America's involvement, particularly in the sort of military industrial complex in the Middle East and in Israel in particular, I would say that it would be in the best interest of both Republicans and Democrats to settle things as quickly as possible, especially Biden going into this election. Now, but the problem is when you do have Republicans that uh, have a very cavalier attitude towards human life and towards very complex geopolitical issues, especially in the Middle East, the way that things are already in the Middle East, incredibly complex. But I do see, and here's the thing though, there is a yearning and a will to sort of put the lid on this and to pivot back towards Ukraine versus Russia.
Oh,
That
you
is a
bet.
much more, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a much more salient thing for American voters. Uh, the fact that it's sufficiently abstracted from American history and involvement. Of course, I mean, and of course, that the spending bill recently. So I think a lot of people within the Biden administration, not Biden himself, because let's not talk about the president of the United States' particular health and longevity situation, but I think that a lot of people in the Democratic Party, they realize that this is not good. And to send the National Guard to the protest, that would be catastrophic. I think
Oh,
yeah. Sorry, I
yeah.
cut you off, Oren. Go ahead. I'm very sorry.
No. I'm with you. I think the only reason I'm going to give Josh Hawley a pass is he also said that they should bring in the National Guard for the BLM riots. So at least
Okay, yeah, then that's yeah,
at
yeah.
least he's an
No,
equal opportunity. This one isn't just
yeah,
for anti-Israel protests. He's just like, when in doubt, National Guard it, and it's like, all
yeah,
right, I can
yeah.
respect that level of
Well,
consistency.
it's not like other people who have a very unprincipled exception that they let things pass, but when it comes to this issue, right? But that being said, I mean, I think that the BLM riots clearly demonstrated a lot of politically motivated violence and destruction. But I don't know. I think, have there been intimidations and have there been violent, perhaps, and then maybe you can argue this. But I mean, yeah, there's been a large number of protests. But like you said, Oren, I mean, uh, as much as there has been involvement by the American state, I think when it comes to these ethnic conflicts, who really bears the brunt of overt protest and violence? It's the American people, obviously,
Yeah.
right? I mean, here in Canada as well, there's been huge protests. I mean, most of them have been peaceful, of course. And like I said, it's their right. Like, listen, I am a big supporter. I was a big supporter of the truckers. And so therefore I would be a hypocrite to say that as long as pro-Palestinian protests on parliaments, in downtown Ottawa, as long as they're being peaceful, then I think it's perfectly fine. But I mean, it is an issue though, because academics don't know what to do now, and a huge swath of the organs of power, they're in a huge conundrum over this. And but like you said, I mean, from a conservative or a politically rightward perspective, it just goes to show you that a lot of the political categories in the Western world have been so thoroughly mixed up and have been so thoroughly um, slotted into a certain direction than what a lot of people truly feel, right? So it's a very complicated issue. But yeah, go on. I know you wanted to cover certain tweets or
Well,
yeah.
I wanted to bring this up because I think Peachy Keenan put this pretty well. She's responding to a tweet that says American colleges and universities spent the last decade censoring conservatives, canceling events,
Hmm.
punishing teachers, etc., because they wanted to ensure their students never felt unsafe. They spent unaccountable millions institutionalizing left-wing diversity programs. And her response, which I think is a very good one, is because no one cared when they came for the white students. White kids are the default villains in academia. No one, except a few conservative voices, even dared to stand up to them. Now that
Oh
Jewish
yeah,
kids are under attack, the institutions built to protect them are doing their job. Protecting them must be nice. And this is the same thing that we saw at Google. I just responded to this story yesterday on
hmm
Twitter that
hmm
Google is saying, "Oh, we can't have any more workplace politics." Literally, the Google is, to remind people, the company who just like last month erased white people from history with their AI bot. Like literally just was like, we can't make white Vikings, we can't even make white SS officers, like because that's
Oh,
how diverse our AI is. That
they had to put by POCSS office.
like that this company
Oh,
is like, oh, we have to get rid of workplace politics. Why? Because anti-Israel stuff is getting in a hand, people aren't feeling safe,
hmm
we want to quiet this down. And Peachy Keen is pointing out the same double standard here, right? I get it. Like if people are being threatened, if there is violence involved, sure, I understand 100%.
yeah,
But all of
yeah.
a sudden, I'm getting a call to put tanks in Harvard Yard. And you know what? I'm pro tanks in Harvard Yard anyway. So if I'm not, my deal is I'm not going to make you explain your sudden interest in putting tanks in Harvard Yard as long
Mm,
as you're willing to do it.
yeah,
However, she makes a really good point that we have seen this kind of animus. We've seen this level of violence. We've seen this level of hateful speech and protest and attack towards people of European descent across college campuses in North America and the wider Western world for a decade. And nobody
yeah.
cared. Nobody cared. It was, oh, the kids are going woke. We got a couple of rants. Ben Shapiro owns some people with facts and logic. But no one was talking about, oh, I need to, where's the 101st Airborne, right?
Right.
None of that. And all of a sudden, boom, like clockwork, this has popped up.
Well,
And
yeah.
you have to think, okay, so I guess there was this understanding that eternally there was going to be some carve out for the stories of colonization and all of this stuff, all those narratives that apply to broader Europe were not
Settler
going to apply.
colonialism, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we're not going to be applied to Israel, and now they are, and all of a sudden, boom! It's time to deploy the Marines. It's time to shift, get rid of politics. It all has to go because we've finally found a group worth defending. It just seems pretty gross from all sides.
Oh yeah, it is. I mean, I think that okay, you can make the argument that the British involvement in that region of the Middle East back, even before World War II, you could argue that a lot of the lines weren't drawn properly, and there was a lot of degree of, I'm choosing my word carefully here. Uh, there was a lot of degree of being intimidated because of certain narratives of actually settling a lot of these issues. Because, I mean, how long has the Israel Palestine issue been going on? 70, 80, almost 80 years now?
Oh, I mean, yeah, when settlers started moving in would have been like the late
Yeah.
1800s. Depending
Okay.
depending on
Yeah.
when you want to
So
start marking it.
more,
Yeah,
right? Yeah. And so I think that, but the problem is, though, when you use the narrative of like settler colonialism and all that, it feeds into domestic culture war politics.
right,
And as much as I mean, let's face it, the people protesting on college campuses that are pro-Palestine, they hate us probably. I mean, this is a fact, right?
correct,
But that being said, like my argument is that I think you have to divorce that from what's actually going on in the Middle East. But that doesn't give you any comfort when a lot of the policies that universities have been instituted, like you mentioned. Now, listen, I'm no fan of a lot of the original like post Gamergate people that were going to university campuses, like Steven Crowder or Milo, or like I have criticisms of Christina Off Summers, like I have criticisms of all these figures, right? But at the same time, like they did face genuine death threats and violence, and Berkeley in particular, like I believe they were like fire set when Milo went there, like, and so it was crazy, right? Post Gamergate. First of all, I don't think that going to these universities and giving a lecture, like I remember there was this one where I think it was Steven Crowder and Christina Summers, and the crowd was booing them, and it was like this big spectacle. And so in that sense, I agree with people like Curtis Yarvin to this, in the sense that creating these big spectacles for the political right or conservatives probably wasn't the best policy. But that being said, that older model of the university being a haven of debate and free speech, I mean, that's just gone now. That's over, right? And so when you built, yeah, exactly, Gio being an old head again, although Menachrome used a word I can't use on YouTube. But that being said, I think that because the universities have built up such an apparatus of unprincipled exceptions the whole way through, and that really that like 1960s new left idea of free debate, like that was kind of a ruse to begin with. They're really suffering now when you have people of entirely different historicity and political understanding now confronting the real face of administrative power. And in a sense, I think these universities, they've really like dug their own graves when it comes down to it, like you said, Oren. But like I said, like I even with the Ukrainian Russia issue, is a very complex one, and my fear is that a lot of very complex geopolitical issues, when they are interpolated and taken up into the Western culture war, a lot of the actual genuine nuance gets lost. And but because it is this giant spectacle, I mean, all protest politics, I mean, you don't have to read Burnham, or you don't have to read AA's book, right, on this issue to know that a lot of the populism, either on the left or the right, when it comes to the spectacle and the public ritual of protest, is in a way a weird postmodern spectacle, and in a way really besides the point when it comes to hard decisions that are made both domestically and geopolitically. So, but like I say, there is signs that they're going to probably put this away. I mean, whether or not the Israelis will listen to the Biden administration is a different issue, but there is a lot of political will to just quiet this down. It's incredibly embarrassing for the political left, and they, like I said, and Biden has an election to win against the evil orange Trumpolini. So it's just, and also, by the way, you really do have to give it to Donald Trump to break the paradigm. Hopefully he keeps to it if he gets reelected, but he really does break the paradigm of the Republican Party by saying that, you know what, I think this is bad too. I don't want these people to die. And I think he wants a negotiated settlement. Whether or not that's politically tenable in the Middle East is a different story. But the fact that Donald Trump is willing to grade against the norm of Republicans that, when it comes to the Ukrainian issue and the Israeli issue with Gaza, have posted some very wild and very deranged things about, like, let's destroy them all, and like things I can't say on YouTube. Like, legitimate politicians have been posting this. There was this Republican in Texas, I forget her name, but she posted that if Ukraine falls, next America's gonna fall.
Yeah.
So you saw that, right?
Yeah.
And so, but because a lot of this is really the blowback of 2000s and 90s and 80s neoconservatism, where they do treat these very complex geopolitical issues as if they are basically defending America and the shining rock on the hill, even though a lot of those policies we can look back. I mean, both of us are millennials, Oren. I mean, you're a bit older than me, but like, core millennial nevertheless.
Thanks, Gio. I appreciate it.
Yeah, but like we can look back on it. Well, even as a Gen Xer, like, you were the generation, your co-patriots, the young men that you grew up with, Oren, you were the ones that went over to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think to live under the persistent aura of what happened in the 2000s, I mean, it's something that millennials, of course, don't like to think about because it's very, destructive, and it has a lot of political implications that we'd rather put away. But when you really think about it, I mean, the foreign policy of America for the last, I would say 80, maybe 70, 60, at least 60 years, at least 30 years, has not really served the interests of the American people, which I know is a common point, and maybe we should move on to more theory-driven topics, because I'm just, we're going into political analysis, and then that's kind of like, but to give you a good tie-in, Oren, the politics of the spectacle has been something that's very persistent, even when it's divorced from hard power. and the way things operate, you still have this model of protest, of either left-wing or right-wing populism. Of course, post-Charlottesville, right-wing populism in terms of public spectacle, you saw a little bit with Trump and Trump rallies, but I mean, let's face it, that's been effectively punished by the state.
Oh yeah.
But now that you're seeing that this is being punished by the state, or at least the workings of it are being punished by the state, there's a whole lot of political confusion going on. And yeah.
Honestly, I don't think it's going to be punished by the state. I think that they're
No,
making. I
probably
think they're
not.
making a show. At most, they're slapping some people on the wrist. I don't know if you remember when the squad got arrested for
Yeah,
protesting, and they
yeah,
had to like fake
yeah.
putting their hands behind them because they didn't even handcuff them.
Or like Greta Thunberg getting dragged away, and like every few months she gets dragged
Yeah.
away by the police.
I
Yeah.
really I think that they have to go through the motions because the group being attacked is considered a little more worthy of protection
Mhm.
in the progressive hierarchy. But honestly, I don't think they can put this back in the box. Of course, this is my whole debate with AA. I think it will eventually quiet down. I think that eventually Israel will kind of achieve its goal, and this will fall off the radar of 90% of
Right.
people. And so it doesn't really matter. I mean, let's be honest, outside of college, universities, and super online people, if you ask the average person what's going on in Israel, Palestine right now, they'd have no clue. This is
Right.
like Ukraine is far more, like you said, salient for most Americans. That's something everyone actually knows, at least to some degree, is happening. As where I think this barely registers for anybody who's not directly plugged in.
Mhm.
So I don't think I think you'll probably see the kind of the mainstream left beat back the woke vanguard slightly here, but I don't
Yeah.
think there'll be a definitive victory for them. I think that that's going to continue to see the
Yeah,
rise of the
they're
woke
not
left.
gonna crack down the way they did with those campus protests, with campus speakers, or with Charlottesville, or with Trump rallies even. They're not gonna no, they're not gonna jail any. I mean, they'll jail a few people that are actually staging intimidations of certain academics,
Right.
but no, they're not gonna crack down the way they have with a lot of, well, even recently, I mean, what was it Switzerland or was it Czechoslovakia? Which country they cracked down in a NACON?
Oh,
They
I think it was in Brussels, wasn't it? Or no,
It was
where was it?
Brussels.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, no, that's not. I mean, they'll let the protests more or less try to peter itself out, as the news cycle continues. Because even still, like people, uh, it's very funny when it comes to the news cycle, when it comes to the sort of decentralized media apparatus you find in places like X, Twitter, where people, when the Iran thing happened, people are immediately giving their takes like, oh, something's happening, and it's gonna really lead to something, and people are hyperventilating on Twitter Spaces, and some Twitter Spaces have like 10,000 listeners, and they're like breaking news, and it really. But then, of course, what happens is this, like what usually happens in the Middle East, where there's a lot of chest thumping, there's a lot of exchanges back and forth. I believe Iran had to admit that the one of the bases may have not been attacked, or who knows what happened, right? Because it's all up in the air. But then you have the cycle that gets grafted onto it, where people are almost yearning for it. They're yearning for something to happen, even though it might, drag us into a new war. So I think it really is kind of like a thirst for annihilation in some ways. It's a thirst for the ecstasies of something happening, which is very, I think, politically dangerous. And it's dangerous in terms of political discourse as well, because people are craving for a happening, and there's either frustration, or when happenings do occur, people. I think it's sort of like it's sort of like in Revelation. I may be pissing off some evangelicals here, but it's sort of like when Revelation, where it is said that Christ will return like a thief in the night. Like the happening will occur like a thief in the night. When a happening occurs, you're not going to hear it on a Twitter Space. It's going to be something that will catch people politically off guard. I mean, even the Ukraine conflict, there were certain people that did predict that it was going to happen. But yeah, so I think happenings will occur like a thief in the night, more or less, Auron. So yeah.
All right, well, let's go ahead and try to transition to the theoretical topic of the of the stream today, which is postmodernism. So the reason I want to address this, Gio, is I feel like there's so much jargon thrown around about, around this topic. People rarely understand, the postmodernists are after our kids and stuff, like it's
Mhm.
that, but there's not, and there's a good reason to be worried about postmodern theory and many things that the postmodernists have said. But I think it's often so far removed from the actual context of the movement and the moment we're in. And nobody really thinks about the implications of the moment we're in. If we're not going to embrace postmodernism, which I don't think we should, then we need to think about what else we would be embracing, where else we would be going. So I wanted to begin at the beginning, just to lay out some basics for people. What is modernity? What is postmodernity? When did this transition happen, if it happened at all?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. It's tough because I think that when people think of these issues in terms of like reifying time periods, uh, a great writer that I think we should bring up is Bruno Latour, who wrote this book called We Were Never Moderns. Because, okay, so to set this up, the claim of modernity being that time in terms of development is more or less stable, more or less linear, and that the whole world can be sunk into a modernist understanding of things, that we can pick apart nature, that man in relation to nature is increasingly abstract and increasingly a narrative of what a lot of postmodernists would call logocentrism, where the primacy of human intelligence and of human language triumphs over nature. But what Bruno Latour is saying, and then of course postmodernity, is the criticism of the frustration of the modernist project. Now, listen, a lot of the original post-structuralists and postmodernists, they were of the new left, of course. There was a huge intersection there. And they talked about how the issues of various platforms of social justice, there's certain narratives that for example, Western education and Western thought has ignored. And it's like trying to pick apart the various contradictions and issues that have not been highlighted and peoples that are sort of quote unquote left out of the equation. And so postmodernism is really, if we go to say the Leotardian definition, would be the criticism, or rather the awareness of the very slippery and fibrous notions of grand meta narratives in society. And rather, these meta narratives, either they're, oppressive structures, or there's something that just simply does not graft onto the quote unquote real of what we experience. And that when you look down at the basis of things, most of it is language, most of it is discourse, and most of it comes from the ideational space rather than anything we can point to as for example, a dialectical movement in history. So that's something that we can't really observe. And so even postmodernism was very critical of orthodox Marxism, for example, because Marxism has a lot of predicates of what is social justice, of what is the movement of history, because they get this from Hegel, right? Of what we can see as a movement of capitalism. And so if you look, for example, to Frederick Jameson in his book Postmodernism, the logic of late modernity, the logic of late capitalism, but you could also call it late modernity. He points to the fact that you have this increasing decentralization of all things. You have a decentralization of information, and you also have, in the absence of grand meta narratives, you have a total collapse or a sort of a deterritorialization of culture. So, for example, there's no longer the high art, low art distinction. There's a sort of planetization of cultural products. Capitalism, of course, is the handmaiden of this, or late capitalism, in spreading various culture industry products throughout the world. And you don't have a sort of a very cohesive civilizational narrative. But let's go back to Bruno Latour now, okay? So Bruno Latour in We Were Never Modern, he questions the assumption that we were modernist to begin with. Because what we see is that man is still in dialogue with the natural world. The project of the total revealing of nature has not been fulfilled. But also when it comes to quote unquote modernity, when it comes to various places throughout the world, we can see that we're living in a sort of mishmash of people that have a different awareness of what modernity is. People live lives around the world that are thoroughly that you wouldn't consider quote unquote modern. the way that we would consider it in the West. And so you have to really address this hard distinction between, okay, we live in a modern period. Now we have post-modernity where we're criticizing it and we're criticizing those claims towards it. So in a sense, what Latour is trying to say, and again, I'm butchering this for time's sake. What Latour is saying is that to say that there's a post-modernity is the sweeping assumption that we were modern, quote unquote, to begin with, that history is a progressive linear entity that we can visibly observe, that man's conquest of nature and the deconstruction of the natural world is more or less a surety, and that all people have been lifted up into this construct we call modernism. Whereas we don't observe any of those things. And postmodernism, as a reaction to that, Latour says, is equally something that is kind of absurd at its heart. And so, in a sense, we can see that postmodernism, in a way, is really a reification and an acceleration of a lot of the predicates of the promises of modernity. That modernity has tried to perfect itself to the point of being an absence of itself, of going beyond itself. But I personally, I think a lot of thinkers such as Zygmunt Bauman, John David Ebert, for instance, comes to mind. They call it liquid modernity or hypermodernity. I think that is a more productive term for the sort of the place that we're living in now currently when it comes to politics and culture in the internet age. Hypermodernity is, to me, more of an apt descriptor than quote unquote postmodernity. Because even postmodernity itself, for example, the claim towards relativism. Relativism, maybe for a time in terms of academic discourse, but I don't see relativism anywhere. I see an extension of a sort of modernist moralism or a morality complex that modern politics has been subsumed under. So a lot of people, a lot of critics in the political right or normie conservatives that talk about postmodern relativism, I think I don't see relativism anywhere. Like, where is this relativism? Right? Like, I mean, people still believe things. We don't live in a amoral society. We live in an incredibly moralistic society. It's just that the morality is quite different from a lot of pre-modern traditional systems of morality and theology and so forth. So we live in a very different form of ontological politics or a moralistic politics than, say, a lot of people that criticize postmodernity, such as who is the academic at Hillsdale? He wrote a whole book on postmodernity. What's his name? I'm forgetting. I'm blanking right now.
Yeah.
But he talks about the relativism aspect. I think that's probably one area in which critics of postmodernity have gotten wrong, is that the relativism claim has sort of been overemphasized. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this was an article that Alexander Dugin put out, and he
Mhm.
mentioned the fact that in many ways postmodernism had become as dogmatic as modernism, had become as much of a narrative and a very fixed thing, bringing
Mhm.
forward, like you said, a lot of non-relativistic points. Having a very specific idea of what the world should look like and how to prescribe it. One of the things that happened recently, I don't know if you saw this, Chris Rufo has been tweeting out like everything that the new NPR CEO has said. He's just got it set on some kind of repeat every hour. It just pumps out
Oh
something
yeah.
ridiculous. And so
Mhm.
this new female CEO has said many things that are pretty bog standard leftist things. And one of
Yeah.
the things that she talked about was she used to be in charge of Wikipedia, or one of the people in charge of Wikipedia, and she said, one of the things we recognize is at first we went with kind of this open and free, model. But the purpose of the open and free model was to create equality. And what we learned was that openness and freedom does not create equality. It creates the
Mhm.
opposite, which is a revelation that I think hurts conservatives as much as it does the leftists. But
Well,
her
every time there's
response,
a lack of moderation, spaces online become right wing automatically for
yeah,
some
it's a
reason.
weird thing that keeps happening that way. It's like there's some kind of natural order, but that emerges. But she specifically said, "Look, we got rid of the openness and the freedom because the primary goal was equality, and all of these mechanisms of openness and freedom, they were these kind of liberal modern solutions to bring about this thing." And so it feels like a lot of conservatives looked at the tools of kind of liberalism and modernity and thought that those
Mhm.
were the ends,
Yeah.
as where the postmoderns thought that the end was the equality or other promises made by liberalism. And the disconnect is between the application of these tools and the ends, and why the application of tools didn't bring about the ends, and why it's not okay or is okay to abandon the tools if they don't bring about the ends. And I pointed this
Right.
out, and then like local distance came in. It's like, no, that's ridiculous. Liberalism doesn't believe that. It's like I'm pretty sure that's exactly what the postmoderns have said. But okay,
Yeah.
but internet disagreements aside, it feels like there's this big disconnect where conservatives don't realize that the large amount of what the postmoderns were doing and what they're trying to enforce, because like you said, it's not relative. Like they want a goal. They have an end point in mind for what society should look like and what values should be
Mhm.
enforced. But they don't understand. They thought that the tools to reach those ends were the actual values, as where the
Right.
postmoderns had the goals in mind, and they're more than willing to discard the old tools if they don't reach the ends they were supposed to.
Well, right. I mean, even Frederick Jameson in Postmodernism, Logic of Late Capitalism, he even said this, I believe, in a few introductory chapters, where he said, like, even reactionaries can become postmodernists. There's such a thing as a postmodern reactionary, and that really the open template of critique and deconstruction. And deconstruction is a very complicated term because I think a lot of people on the political left, like will call distance, like James Lindsay, they take that to mean like just the destruction of values. Whereas if you actually look at, if you've spent countless hours, such as I have, unfortunately, looking at a lot of post-structuralist texts from Derrida all the way up to Baudrillard. Um, Baudrillard does have quite a bit of reactionary talking points, by the way,
Yeah.
as in terms of his pure postmodernism. I would say that deconstruction is responding to a philosophic tradition and doesn't necessarily mean the destruction of values per se, but rather just realizing the sort of hierarchy of texts, why certain assumptions with analyzing texts are placed upon people in terms of the reader, in terms of the relation between the other and the self. A lot of the deconstructive method is simply that. It's just a method of approaching the text. And then a lot of certainly the activist class around the 1980s to the present day have sort of like ascribed a lot of weirdo political intention to the phrase deconstruction. Now you mentioned Dugan. Now let me just clarify right off the bat that I have read a lot of Dugan. I'm not myself a Duganist. I have a lot of severe criticisms of Alexander Dugan. I think that you have to recognize, and was a time when a lot of Western right wingers were reading him. A lot of publications were translating his work, but that time has passed because I think you have to recognize that. And Michael Miller, and forgive me for saying this, but um, you have to recognize that Dugan has his own agenda in terms of the civilization that he has formulated in terms of Eurasianism.
Oh,
And I
absolutely.
think and I think you have to be cautious of that. Like you have to be cautious with every reader. And I think that as a Westerner who is on the political right, who is a conservative, you have to really take what he's saying with a grain of salt. Because, for example, when it comes to postmodernism, he is correct in terms of tracing it back to a lot of Western Enlightenment principles. But what he's doing with that criticism is something that I wouldn't say is within the interests of Western people or even Western right wingers. And
Yeah.
so I think a lot of the media spectacle around Dugan being like this Rasputin like figure, or like Western right wingers or Russia shills, or that Dugan. I mean, there has been Western right wingers that have been in dialogue with Dugan, but for example, he mentions the Nouveau Droit in that article, the European New Right, the French New Right. A lot of those people hate Dugan. They think he's a clown. A lot of them have sided with Ukraine, for instance. A lot of Western right wingers have sided with Ukraine, by the way. Um, I mean, I'll stay. I'm not going to go further in my position in that conflict, but I think that you have to take what Dugan is saying with a grain of salt, because certainly his criticism of postmodernism is quite interesting in that he wants to find a synthesis between tradition and the postmodern condition. But I think that synthesis relies on a lot of assumptions that run contrary to what a lot of Western people think and feel and believe, and what a lot of people in the political right in the West also think and feel and believe. His criticism is certainly interesting. For example, he does mention Latour. He mentions Heidegger, and he's trying to create the synthesis between the traditionalist school, for example, Rene Guignon and Martin Heidegger. I wouldn't consider Martin Heidegger a postmodernist, by the way. He's more of an existential ontologist. But I think that a lot of assumptions he makes is sort of kind of complicated and won't really fit. And a lot of the blame that he asserts on the West is also something not advantageous to a conservative project in North America, for instance. For example, he has his own version of relativism. He really harps upon this like third worldism and anti-racism, which is very funny how people call him like an evil fascist. I mean, he does have certain fascistic tendencies, but in terms of like his third worldism, he really is sort of taken up this whole thing about Western racism and Western neocolonialism.
Oh yeah, it's everywhere in his work. Yeah.
But I will say the reason I bring this up is because you have to really examine with a grain of salt what he says, because there's a lot of times where he says very contradictory statements. For example, he's saying that years ago he'll say like Ukrainians, we're all Belarusians, we're all brothers. Then when the war happens, he says very kind of off the rail things about Ukrainians. He'll say like there's statements he's made about criticizing multiculturalism, but then he said, well, Russia has the superior multiculturalism and we have to back our brothers in Africa and so forth. And so, yeah, I think Dugin, I think his story is more complex when it comes to being in dialogue with the Western political right. So I myself do not consider myself a Duginist, but his criticism of postmodernism, he's trying to find a way to safeguard against the excesses of what he perceives as Western postmodernism. But to do that, he's sort of like creating this weirdo Eurasianism, which is like kind of defeating the point in some ways in that article. But nevertheless, it's very interesting because he is very well learned. He's very well learned when it comes to Heidegger and post-structuralism. But I think that like all critics of postmodernism, whether it be him, whether it be a lot of critics of postmodernism who are Marxist, they're going to have to contend with postmodernism as a mode of critique that is there whether you like it or not, whether you can deal with it or not. Because in some ways, and it could be either a black pill or a clear pill. Again, I have severe criticisms of Curtis Yarvin, but I do think the clear pill thing is an interesting concept. So it can either be a black pill or a clear pill, which is that postmodernism as a mode of critique is not a sort of unified movement or a unified political enemy, but it's just rather the condition by which we find ourselves in an advanced technological and digital society. And we have to realize that we're coming in, and this is what Dugin says, and you can criticize him as well. And this is what other people, even Bruno Latour, says, is that you're coming into dialogue with people that have radically different histories and radically different understandings because we live in a globalized world. And so in a sense, postmodernism is just a natural progression of things from modernity, or rather hypermodernity is more of a natural progression of things, in that we live in a technological society, we live in a digital society, and we live in an awareness of different peoples throughout the world. And therefore, for example, Mbembe, who wrote Necropolitics, talks about this. Now, I'm critical of that book as well, because it is a book of the current New Left. It is very like harps upon anti-colonialism and so forth. But it's a very interesting book. I broke that down on my YouTube channel, by the way, my podcast, General Reviews. But even Mbembe says this as well, that we have an awareness of the greater global South. Therefore, we're going to have to question a lot of our prior ideological predicates. So to wrap it all up, yes, I think Dugin's an interesting reader of postmodernism. Mbembe is an interesting critic of postmodernism as well. But I think that all of these authors, you have to come up with a discernment and you have to take them with a grain of salt. Because like I said, a lot of these authors, whether it be New Left thinkers or current New Left thinkers like Akila Mbembe, or even people that are Eurasianists like Dugin, or people that are even on the political right who are critics of postmodernism, you have to all take these people with a grain of salt, because it's trying to examine the conditions that we live in presently. When it comes to the ought, though, that's different. And I will criticize people like Woke All Distance, as I always do, in the sense that, well, liberalism ought to be this way. And we have to go back to that awareness of what liberalism is. But if liberalism is creating the conditions of a liquid or hyper or postmodern society, then that calls into question a lot of those ideological predicates that Western liberalism coming from the Enlightenment has created. And it's very easy to say that, well, the Frankfurt School, I mean, the Frankfurt School does have a lot of impact on the New Left. I'm not denying that. But when it comes to the sort of linear narrative of like, okay, there was modernism and that was beautiful because we were like classical liberals and that was great. Then there was this evil postmodernism that came and destroyed everything and it's terrible. Like, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And equally, Dugin's narrative of like, we were heckin' wholesome Eurasianists and we did multiculturalism the right way, but then the evil Westerners came and it's like, oh my God, right? They're inflicting postmodernism on our glorious Eurasian empire. That's also a cut and dry. Now, I for the sake of clarity, I'm robbing both Dugin and James Lindsay and Akila Mbembe of nuance, but I do think that it behooves us to criticize all of these thinkers, right? Yeah. And it doesn't, regardless of what political side you're on. So
yeah. I mean,
I know it's a mouthful, but yeah.
Just to echo what you're saying there, I truly wish that like Dugin was not in any way associated with Putin, just because I find his thought something that gets me thinking. And I'm with you. It's very odd. In fact, it's almost sometimes comical how much of a sore thumb like his own project is in his thought. Like, it just sticks out. It's very awkward. Doesn't jive with other things he said and done. It's almost like he just stopped in the middle of writing a scholarly paper, dropped the agenda in, and then continued on with what he was doing
and became a political polemicist for Russia. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like, and so it's a very unfortunate, because like I said, I do find it, there are certain thinkers that just, I run into what they're saying and I'm like, oh man, this opens something up for me. This helps me to understand or grasp something or put something together. And he is at times one of those people, but I'm with you that his project is garbage. He hates the West. Like, it's very, he's hoping for total Anglo destruction. Like, it's very clear. Like, he's not a fan. And so I'm not here to to hold his project up or anything. But I do think it's just interesting.
Just in case anyone's listening, we're not Duginists. We're not like endorsing Alexander.
To be very clear, I understand that ultimately he hates the West.
No, I have my criticisms of the American policy towards Ukraine, obviously. However, I will say I pray for a negotiated settlement. I pray for the needless destruction of people in Eastern Europe to end. That's one. I just want to make that clear.
Absolutely.
But and even Akila Mbembe, I spent multiple videos reading line for line Necropolitics, because Necropolitics truly is a monumental work of scholarship. But there are even instances where it's like, okay, like the whole like post-colonial leftist narrative, it's like, oh God. But you expect it, right? You expect it. It's he comes from that understanding. He's a post-colonial scholar. And, you have to respect where people come from, right? And like, equally, his narrative is not, in the interests of certainly Western right-wingers, right? But it's a very interesting text nevertheless. But even when you said, Auron, like when it comes down to it, I think that there is criticisms to be made of the Anglo and European and Germanic Enlightenment. But when it comes down to it, though, a lot of those concepts, in a way, were inevitability when you go further into the Western tradition. And so, I did my little bit back in the day in the 2000s of like being anti-Enlightenment, but I think that a lot of the Enlightenment, Western Enlightenment, is a very rich source of what is like the sort of, European consciousness. And to say that all of it was evil because of what's been produced now, or rather the perversions of Enlightenment thinking. And that's unfortunate with Dugin, is that he takes up the perversions of Enlightenment thinking and he constitutes that as the whole thing. And of course, he's very anti-Western. So, and even when it comes right down to it, for example, like even, Marxism does this as well. They'll take the Enlightenment, they'll, predicate certain things about Hegel over others. We all do this, right? But I think that, for example, one last point of criticism of Dugin is that he mentioned Spangler in that article. Mm-hmm. And he mentions that Spangler is a critic of the West. I personally do not believe that Oswald Spangler was a quote-unquote critic of the Western Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. I think that Spangler was recognizing the awareness of a cyclical nature to all political constructs and to all civilizations and cultures. And so it's rather the recognition of a cyclical nature of winter, eventually winter will come. And so I don't think that Dugin necessarily is a like an anti-Western critic in that, like, I mean, Dugin says very interesting things. Sorry, Spangler. Dugin is definitely a critic of the West,
Yeah,
yes.
sure.
But Oswald Spangler, I don't think that you could claim that he's like an anti-Western thinker. To me, that just doesn't make any sense. He's rather recognizing that there's always going to be a decline in things, that it's natural, but the sort of Faustian spirit creates certain things and has a certain awareness of itself. And of course, Spangler, there's criticism of Spangler as well. But I wouldn't label him as an anti-Western thinker. I think Dugin is
I
just
would say that
Yeah.
Dugin, or that Spengler would think it almost impossible to be an anti-Western critic from inside the West. That your
Yeah.
even your critique of Western man would be colored by your
Right.
existence inside that society. Before we go, or rather before we transition over to the questions of the people, I know we packed this with a lot of breaking news, so we didn't spend a lot of time on the main topic. But I may be asking you to the impossible.
Well, we'll have to do another one.
Yeah. We'll just roll it over. But I may be asking the impossible question in just a few minutes. But given what we've said here, that there are critiques that postmodernity has brought, that it is not purely something that is deconstructed, but it is also it's not something that's completely um, uh, relativistic, but brings its own expectations and its own demands. We're in the moment we're in now, right? And I think for so many people, you've mentioned some of the classical liberals who just want to go back to the 90s, or the conservatives that just want to go back to the 50s. And they see this as the alternative to postmodernism. Dugin, as you say, brings in this kind of synthesis. He tries to bring in his Eurasianism to this. But for those of the Western tradition who recognize that however you feel about the Enlightenment or modernity or whatever, we have gone through it. It is occurred. So it's no longer, you can critique it, you can revile it, you can or embrace it, you can do whatever you want with it, but it has happened, right? And we are looking forward, but we do not want to embrace the postmodern structure. We don't want to embrace the demands that they place on society. What would an alternative look like that is Western in nature? And I know that's a huge question, but even if there's just like some outline or some general guidance, what would it look like to look forward and find something that is not postmodernism, but is also not just a retreat back to the 90s or the 50s?
Well, the problem with retreat is that then it relies on a very kitschified image of the past. Apparently, boomers in the 50s and thinking that everything's like a Norman Rockwell painting. But in terms of an alternative, I think that the alternative could be a form of, I don't want to say post-liberalism because that term has been abused by certain thinkers that have this like weirdo communitarian stuff going on. But I do think that in some ways you could go back to the original spirit of what those Enlightenment thinkers were honing in on, that is unique to a lot of Western consciousness. But I think that you're going to have to tussle with a lot of the assumptions, or rather the critique of a lot of assumptions that the postmodernists have brought to the table, which in a way is what Dugin was trying to do, but he has a lot of ideological blind spots. I think that there's going to have to be an establishment of a new political order and a new cultural order that can find a way to not necessarily go back to a different time, not necessarily negate in toto a lot of postmodern critiques of the modern world, but rather a form of like almost like a futurism in a way that is. I don't have the answers. I've thought about this for a long time, but I think in a way you'd have to find a sort of political awareness of something that is future orientated, that has a project that is worth building towards, whatever that project may be. But I think that you're going to have to do it without trying to either negate wholly postmodernism or, do some kind of like weirdo anti-enlightenment romanticism. I mean, there's going to have to be a form of romanticism, obviously, but in a way that doesn't totally take us off the rails into a form of rationalism. Whether this amelioratory, future-orientated politics and cultural project can be at hand, I don't know. Because in a way, a lot of these things are inevitable. So I think Spangler is correct in that sense, that a lot of the decline we're seeing is in some, demonstrative futurism. Even when it comes to religion, I mean, I know there's been a lot of debates on the right, the online right, between paganism and Christianity, and I don't really like weighing into these things either. But yeah, I mean, if you could find a way to have a proper hierarchical political order that recognizes its limitations, but doesn't necessarily abandon those very things that the Western mind has developed, that I think would be a heroic task. But I think this is going to take probably generations, right? Because a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with is the consciousness of the previous century. And this is, you have to realize that postmodernism, and I know like this is a liberal talking point. I know even people like Hannah Arendt talks about this, but I mean, to give credit where it's due, because she was a great scholar, right? I mean, there's a lot of criticisms of Hannah Arendt that could be had, but I think that a lot of postmodern thought came after the 20th century because the project of modernism led to a lot of the atrocities of the 20th century. And I think that as time goes on, you're going to have to sort of find a way to heroically cleave ourselves out of that huge, like literal bomb of modernity in the 20th century. And I know that she talks about this in Origins of Totalitarianism. And I know that's that's like a liberal assumption about things. But no, I think that a lot of either restorative or futurist politics can only happen as time goes on, because we're still dealing with a lot of the ideological problems of the 20th century. Yeah. We're still dealing with the sort of the mythos of a lot of those ideologies. Even the conservatives have this when they talk about communism, for instance, right? So I think that as time goes on, these things will become more clear, because there's going to have to be a shift in the political order, or else we're just going to languish forever in critique or in half-hearted social decay and cultural decay as well. That's a huge thing. That's a huge problem. And this is a huge problem even with conservatives, is that a lot of people, both in the left and right, they go towards this sort of kitschified image of a cultural aesthetics and a political aesthetics. And this is what my book that I've written that I'm currently editing, it's called, hopefully I have it out by September. It's going to be called Neoliberal Kitsch, Online Art and Aesthetics in the 21st Century. A lot of the problem is that both the political left and right have this kitschified politics that relies on a kitsch image, a kitsch aesthetic. Either what we're seeing now with Columbia University, the kitsch aesthetics of revolutionary protest, or the conservative kitsch politics of wanting to live in a Norman Rockwell painting forever. So we have two rival regimes of kitsch that are sort of battling it out. And it really, I think that we're going to have to move on from that. I think that's not very conducive to lifting ourselves off into something greater, whatever that greater might be. I know I'm speaking in vague generalities because it's something that I have yet to deal with. Because the problem again is that there's a lot of like thought terminating cliches when you do discuss a politics of futurism, because people will call you a fascist or whatever, or even like a lot of people, like Wokal Distance or whoever, like a lot of the classical liberals, they have a lot of like the weird like Dinesh D'Souza, like, the communists and the fascists are getting together to destroy liberalism. And so
to be fair, that is the Dugan Project, but no.
Of course, the Nazball thing, right? Yeah. But whether or not, like in terms of in the West, whether that's a presence is debatable, to say the least.
No, I hear you, and like I said, I knew that was a difficult question before I fielded it to you. I think one of the biggest problems, and this is going to be my drum as my own book comes out, and just in general, is I think much of it is a matter of scale. I don't think these problems get solved. I think the reason that you fall back on ideology and kitschify culture is that you have processed these things through giant institutions
Yes.
and marketing, and you've abstracted them to the point where they've lost all context from like actual organic communities. And I don't think you can solve these problems without a return, not to a particular
Right.
time, but a way of being that acknowledges that those things need to be grounded in specific people and places and
Well,
time.
like just to wrap up, or and like I think it's a point worth repeating is that postmodernism really was just a reaction to the 20th century, the late 20th century. Um, and I think like a lot of that is a natural outgrowth of a lot of assumptions of what the Western Enlightenment project was gearing up towards, anyways. And but then again, there's sort of one thing I will say is that there's always we don't see it because, like you said, we live in very institutionalized ideological distinctions. But I do think that there probably was a time where things could have been different. Things could have went. There's sort of like a weird plasticity or conjecture to the timeline of the 20th to the 21st century. People like I know he was a Marxist, but he was a brilliant thinker. But people like Mark Fisher, for instance, talked about this, about how there was sort of like a specter. There was we're haunted. It's a hauntology. We're haunted
Mhm.
by the various possibilities of what could have happened, and instead of what did happen. And you can sort of, and with postmodernism, one of the saving points is that there's a weird eclecticism when it comes to ideas and concepts, and that you can sort of like pick them out of the air, you can bring them back, like all culture can come back, all things can come back, or you could like selectively ignore certain things above others. I mean, really, the internet age that we live in, that's what we're living through, is that people can choose to be aware of certain things, people can choose to adopt certain contradictory ideological positions or aesthetic positions. There's a lot of aesthetic politics where the image is what really matters over the substance of ideology. And that's really like, it's just a recognition of the times that we're living in. And so, yeah, we could have been in a different position, but unfortunately we're not. And we're still haunted by those possibilities.
All right, Gio, before we switch over to the questions of the people, I know you got that book that you're working on, and I
Mm.
feel for you because editing your own book is terrible.
Well, I have help from a good friend of mine
Oh,
who's
good,
very
good.
good.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah.
also had help.
Yeah.
But before we switch over to the questions, is there anything that you want to let people know about, where they can find your various podcasts and or pieces, anything that they should be looking for in the near future?
Well, I have two flagship podcasts. One is Content Minded. I also do giant reviews. People have been paying me money to review various films and texts. But my YouTube channel is Giant Productions. You can find me on Twitter, Giant Geo, Telegram, Giant Productions. My Patreon, patreon.com/Giant Productions, for great content. I try to release a lot of different stuff a week. I have a lot of like subscriber content at different tiers. So yeah, and also we had to change times though. But my second podcast is with Prudentialist, Digital Archipelago. So now the new time for Digital Archipelago is Tuesday at nighttime at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard, because Prude he's taken on a new job, and so we had to switch the times. So tomorrow we're going to cover the rise and the fall of the hipster, and we're reading this article from way back in 2012 from the New York Times on the hipster and irony culture, and it really predicted a lot of the ironic detachment that people have. So hopefully tomorrow, it's on my channel, Giant Productions. So yeah, Digital Archipelago, check it out, and Content Minded.
Excellent. All right, guys, make sure you're checking out Gio's work. Our questions here. ML Wiz says, "Good show, fellas. Thank you very much, man.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
that." Cooper Weirdo says, "This reminds me of the Negative XP song. I can't
Oh,
say
which
I'm
one?
familiar with
Bad
that.
Vibes.
Not familiar with that one, but thank you, sir." He
Hmm.
says, "I poke AA a lot, but he did bring up two interesting books: Jews Don't Count and Woke Anti-Semitism. Strange times that we live in." Yeah, those are things. That current status of whether or not Jewish settlers in Israel count as colonialists, whether they count as white. This is something that's very much impacting the current narratives in schools, in colleges, with the whole woke vanguard versus the establishment on the left. showdown is based on kind of the application of this language. So you're right; those are
Mm.
interesting subjects here. Reagan Lodge says, "Thanks for having Gio on. Fez Gang, stay
Mm.
winning." It's always nice when people bring their own crew with them. You know, Jay Bird
Oh
Nugget,
yeah.
all the beavers show up. You know, you got the Fez Gang. So
Right.
Creeper Reader says line dot squiggles. All right, thank you. Sorry.
Like
uh
Kandinsky painting. Yeah.
Dugan sounds like a not so sensible centrist, or no sensible centrist. Yeah, he's definitely not a centrist. Like I said, interesting, often brings a perspective that I think opens things up for me to investigate. But Gio's absolutely right to warn that he needs to be read with giant chunks of salt, because
A critical eye.
yeah,
Yeah.
he definitely has a very obvious. Like I said, once you notice the project, it's everywhere and it's so obvious it's almost painful. So I think it's pretty easy to read him while keeping that in mind. But I know it's something people do need to do. Tiny Stupid Demon says, "Pause my reading of Dugan to watch his stream." And yes, it's a very interesting but mixed bag. Yeah, that's pretty much
Mhm.
exactly how I feel about it. Gabe Underground says, "Geocell uprising." Oh man, too many
I hope Gabe
Geocell.
comes back to Twitter. Check out Tuki's Maga, the Sidebar podcast. They review a lot of great works of literature, and they're quite fun. So yeah, Gabe, shout out to Gabe and the Sidebar Pod.
Kuruwita says, "Have you guys seen the lib artist reaction to AI art? It's literally people are conservative about things they love and massively reactionary. It makes the consumers look really dumb." I gotta say, I
Mm.
haven't honestly seen a lot of left wing takes on AI art. What are they feeling right now? Are they scared? Or they think
Oh yeah.
it's reactionary to be worried about it? What's the
Oh, they hate it because they, ironically enough, they bring up the intellectual property right thing. But I think what it is that a lot of the younger Zoomer left wing people on Twitter or on Instagram, some are still on Tumblr. They're threatened by it because a lot of their like very kitschy digital art, like a lot of their fan art or a lot of their OC original content art that has a very succinct digital like post Cal Arts style. They're the ones, and they all have Wacom tablets. They're the ones that are going to be sort of taken over by AI art more than a lot of other. I think fine arts will be fine, but when it comes to the quote unquote industry of illustration, animation, design, those are the fields that are mostly going to be affected by the rise of AI art. Other than that, I think AI art's kind of like a nothing burger, but that's besides the point. It's just another tool. Yeah.
And Gabe Underground follows up and says, "Thoughts on L.E. Fay's idea of archaeofuturism?" Saying that correctly?
Oh, I mean, Archaeofuturism is a very interesting book. Uh, Thea is sort of we. He's got like a weird thing going on now. I know, for example, Fea hates Dugan because Fea is a solid like pro-Ukrainian. But I think that Archaeofuturism is certainly an interesting book. Maybe not a lot of it's tenable in the current political climate, but nevertheless, it is trying to square the impossible circle of tradition and modernity, which yeah, I think that it's interesting nevertheless. Yeah, it's very interesting. Now, whether that synthesis can be had is another question. But because I really think that a lot of people on the political right, they're trying to find that philosopher's stone of how do you square the circle of tradition with a lot of the accoutrements or a lot of the spirit of the modern world. So yeah, I mean, I it's been many years since I've read it, but neither endorse nor throw down. I think it's an interesting work. Yeah.
And Justy says, "Geo or Mac approved magazines, journals, please." I don't do a lot of magazine reading these days.
Mm.
Obviously, I think I am 1776 is putting out good stuff. Men's World, actually, the Blaze is coming out with, I believe, a print magazine here soon. I do have an article submitted for that, so you
Tuki's
can check
Mag is
those
pretty
out.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, yep. That's a. I'm trying to think of other excellent ones. Those are the ones that come to my mind right away. But I don't know if you have any more, Geo.
Hmm. Oh, I mean, there was Asylum. There was I'm trying to think. Oh, I mean Passage, but of course Passage Prize, they're only doing the
Yeah,
last one now.
that's
Yeah.
more of a, the contests and everything, but those are great for sure.
I think they're gonna go to this mainstream publishing now. So yeah.
Lego says Ukraine is a Bolshevik project. All right. Well,
There's debate over that, the construction of the Ukrainian state, but I mean that's another stream for another time.
yeah, like
That's
that
like yeah.
could be its own rabbit hole. All right, guys. Well, we're gonna go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming by. Make sure that you're checking out Gio's excellent work, and of course, if it's your first time on this channel, make sure you go ahead and subscribe, turn on the notifications, click the bell so you can see these streams when they go live. Of course, if you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, then go ahead and check out the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. When you do leave a rating or review, it really helps with the algorithm. And of course, if you would like to go ahead and pre-order my book, The Total State, you just got a few weeks left. You can go ahead and do that on Amazon. Thank you, everybody, once again for watching. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.